Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be talking about the new French wheelie boy, the Vextra 105, which is currently the highest tier tech tree French light tank. Now, as a rank 6 light tank, the Vextra does have access to active scouting. It can reduce the cost of your air spawns, and it also has access to a scout drone with thermal imaging when you remember to use it, which often I don't. Now, as you may or may not know, the Vextra is actually a world's first vehicle in War Thunder for one specific feature. It is the very first tech tree vehicle in the entire game to have access to the camo netting modification. In case you're unaware, camo netting adds, well, camo netting to the vehicle. It's pretty straightforward. The camo netting on the Vextra, however, is a lot less useful than it is on some of the other vehicles like the Panzer Battalion 123, because as you can see, it's actually relatively uniform and has about the same shape. It doesn't have any other little bits on it that break up the silhouette of the vehicle or the general outline, so it kind of just makes the vehicle look a little fuzzy, and that's about it. I did mess around with a few things just to see if it had any other special features, such as thermal imaging, and no, it does not change your thermal signature, and despite the fact that it would actually kind of make sense for it to do so, it does not change the visibility percentage of the vehicle either, which is only really useful in arcade battles and some niche applications in realistic battles, but it is still a little odd that it doesn't impact that either. There's no real downside to having the camo netting equipped. It is technically a module, so it does increase your silver repair cost for the vehicle, but it's less than 100 silver per death, so it's not really that big of a deal, and it doesn't add any weight to the vehicle either. So on the whole, if you think it looks cool, equip it. If you don't think it looks cool, don't. There's not really any in-game benefit right now to adding the camo netting, as it basically does nothing. Moving on to the mobility, the Vextra can absolutely haul at about 120 kph max speed, which is obviously a speed you're probably not going to hit in the vast majority of games, as it requires a fairly lengthy stretch of road to get up to. However, 60 to 70 kph is very reasonable for this vehicle, sometimes hitting 80 if you have a nice empty stretch of ground. It's also fairly lightweight for its engine, so it does accelerate incredibly well too. However, when you start getting into the reverse gear, that's when the vehicle starts to fall down. At only 19 kph, it is a little awkward, especially in scenarios where you need to reverse out. And this also brings up another problem in that, unlike the AMX-10RC, the previous French wheeled vehicle, this one does not have neutral steering, so it can't simply spin on the spot. And this can make the Vextra somewhat awkward to maneuver, especially in tight urban environments. This means that while in practice the reverse gear is pretty decent, the inability to use the vehicle ambidirectionally and basically just go forward and reverse at will does mean you're going to have to do a lot of awkward 3-point turns if you really need to get out of the situation quickly, which doesn't jive that well. Overall, I'd say the mobility is definitely its strong suit, but its real strength is simply going in a straight line fast, which is not that different from most of the other wheeled vehicles around this battle rating, although to be fair, it does have a very good power to weight ratio, so it at least accelerates very well and handles hills very well. The durability of this vehicle is where it starts to get interesting and actually kind of disappointing. Now, for a wheeled light vehicle, I imagine most people are coming into this with very low expectations. The bar is probably already set in the mole people's basement. However, the Vextra manages to actually limbo under this bar in several key areas. For the overall armor profile, obviously the armor probably isn't going to be stopping any tank main gun rounds or even really any auto cannons. I did have 1 or 2 shells bounced off the heavily sloped upper front plate, but that's pretty uncommon, and you should just assume everything's just going to go straight through the vehicle. And also 50 cals can go through the side at relatively close range if they have a flat enough angle, so you do have to be aware of that, and that is kind of frustrating, especially as there are quite a few other wheeled vehicles around this battle rating that are nearly immune to 50 cals, or at least close enough to immune that you don't really have to worry about it. The turret is actually free of ammunition, which is always a nice feature, and you'd think it would be really hard to take out the vehicle through the turret, but somehow the forehead of the vehicle directly above the gun shotguns enough shrapnel to the left and right to consistently take out the entire turret crew and knock out the vehicle. Now, just to test this out, I decided to expert the vehicle to see if it was still happening, and it did still happen. However, most opponents don't seem to be aware of this weak point. They just kind of shoot above the barrel because they're used to shooting at the barrel, but you will run into this from time time to time. Of course, the real issue I had with the vehicle's durability is actually the hull and ammo layout. The Vextra has a 12 round ready rack, so you can only take 13 rounds while keeping the ammo in that ready rack, except the ammo ready rack is to the left hand side of the turret right here, and that's actually not a great place for it to be because a lot of shells going center mass are just going to casually pass through it. However, the worst part is actually the ammo behind the first stage ready rack in these two bins in the left and right rear of the hull, and when I was talking about it being awkward to reverse into fights earlier, this is kind of what I'm going at. Because normally in these big wheeled vehicles, if somebody shoots early while you're reversing around the corner, they just hit things like fuel tanks and don't really do any damage. However, with the Vextra, if they shoot early and hit low, they can hit these ammo racks and take out your entire vehicle. After some trial and error, I also discovered that these ammo racks work in the worst possible way. Essentially how they work is the first 2 rounds you take will fill the right side bottom, and then the second 2 rounds you take will fill the left side bottom. So they actually fill symmetrically, so you never really have a safe side to go on unless you're down to 15 rounds or less, which is really irritating. This combines with the fact that the Vextra has a fairly long nose, and if the enemy can disable the driver before your turret gets around the corner, they can obviously just keep shooting the driver in the face and take out your entire vehicle that way. It also probably goes without saying, but if a helicopter or plane takes a liking to you, even if they're just using 20 or 30mm cannons, they will absolutely rip you to shreds as well. While I wasn't exactly expecting this thing to be an absolute brick house, it managed to go well under my expectations, and specifically the biggest aspect was the ammo racks in the back of the vehicle that are just positioned in the worst possible spot, and they also fill in the worst possible way as well. This essentially means there are no usable aspects to your durability. The back of your tank has ammo, the front has the engine and the driver, you can often get ammo racked just by enemies hitting in the middle, and they can even kill you through your turret. So there's really nothing you can do defensively other than just hope you don't get shot, or hope the other person only hits the engine and you can still return fire. Moving on to the firepower aspect, and the Vextra 105 is the very first French light vehicle in the tech tree to have a fully stabilized gun, or kind of stabilized. So this is something I was noticing very early on as I was spading the vehicle, so much so that I had to check to make sure it actually had a 2-plane stabilizer, because it was consistently losing its stability at even modest speeds on any kind of terrain, and I suspect this is because of the suspension and also the elevation rate just simply wasn't high enough to keep up with the movements of the vehicle, and to a large extent these problems with the gun being somewhat unstabilized did go away once I researched the suspension and the vertical drive. So if you are having issues with this, I would highly recommend prioritizing those 2 upgrades. There's one other very weird aspect to the gun that I was not expecting at all and haven't seen on any other vehicle, and it's easier to show you than to specifically try and tell you. Now watch me range find this target. Did you see the range find? You probably didn't, because it's actually way up here. If you zoom all the way in, it actually range finds off screen. You can't actually see the range that it's reporting. Now, if you have the laser rangefinder unlocked, it will automatically set the range for you, but until you have that unlocked, you actually have to zoom out just to see what the range is. I've never seen this happen on any other vehicle, and the zoom is only at 10 times, which isn't that high compared to other vehicles. It might be because the Vextra actually has a very wide field of vision, almost double that of most other vehicles, so that might be contributing to this, but it was just a very weird thing to notice. As you would suspect from most vehicles around this battle rating, the Vextra does feature thermal imaging and a laser rangefinder. It does actually have very high quality thermals, so they're Gen 3, so it is actually a nice crisp, clear picture. Of course, moving on to other aspects of the gun, it does start with a high explosive round, but it only pens about 25mm of armor, so it is virtually useless. The Heat FS round that you start with is actually more usable in the vast majority of situations. Speaking of, the Heat FS round pins about 350mm of armor, so it's decent, but you will face a lot of max up tiers against enemies that are just laden with ERA or other forms of chemical protection, and this shell really will struggle with some of these vehicles. However, the grind to a more usable shell is thankfully pretty short. At rank 2, you unlock your APFSDS round that has a maximum penetration of about 360mm, and this shell is fine. It's almost the definition of fine. A lot of opponents around this battle rating, you're going to have to aim for very specific weak points to realistically have a shot of penetrating, but you can fight anything you meet, even up to the toughest tanks in the game. It's one of those shells that is good enough, but only just, and if it were even a little bit worse, it would kind of be unusable, and it's not like the Vextra has a particularly impressive reload either. At 8.7 seconds stock, it's basically the same as everything else around its battle rating. The last shell type is an unlockable smoke shell at rank 1. Obviously it does all the things smoke shells do and doesn't really need further explanation. The overall picture of the gun of the Vextra is a weapon that is usable if underwhelming. There's really no feature about it that stands out. The gun depression is okay, the reload is okay, the traverse rate is okay, the shell performance is okay. It's just a giant ball of okay. The only reason the firepower of the Vextra really works is because its straight line speed is high enough that it's easy to get into flanking positions, and that really lets the Vextra excel. As far as recommending uses and playstyles for the Vextra 105, it's actually pretty straightforward. The only meaningful advantage you have over every enemy you meet is going to be speed, so you should really be endeavoring to use that as much as possible. Take it out on big maps, take as wide of a flank as you realistically need. You can even take some routes that get you out of bounds because the Vextra is fast enough to get back in bounds relatively easily, and this can get you some nice side shots on enemies or flanking routes where you can hit them from unexpected angles. The Vextra is obviously at its worst in any scenario where you're just forced to confront enemies head on, where your profoundly weak armor and your somewhat underwhelming gun are going to struggle to take on some of the heavier enemies, especially the Russian tanks from the front. If you ask an AI to design a 9.7 wheeled light tank, you would get something that looks eerily similar to the Vextra. It's a very underwhelming and uninspired vehicle in basically every area, while still being just functional enough that you can't necessarily call it a truly bad vehicle. Personally, I found the biggest strike against the Vextra was actually the AMX-40. The AMX-40 is a 9.7 French main battle tank that doesn't quite move as fast as the Vextra in a straight line, although it is still pretty quick, but it does have a much higher reverse gear, it has neutral steer, it actually does have some armor that can bounce shells, it also keeps all of its ammo in a bustle rack, and in addition to that, it has a more powerful gun with exactly the same reload. There are very few scenarios where you'd want the Vextra where you couldn't just use the AMX-40 and have a better result. In this respect, I think the Vextra would have been much better at 9.3, where it's only competing with the AMX-32s that have much worse mobility. With all that being said though, I can't say the Vextra doesn't work. I used it both at its battle rating and in my top tier lineup, and you could still kind of get things done with it. It just wasn't impressive in any real area. But that's just my opinion on the Vextra. If you have experience with it yourself and you love it or hate it, please let me know down in the comments down below. I always love to hear it. If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, don't commit to shoes.